Joining us for our second hour, Greta Bauer is Associate Professor and Graduate Chair, Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, the University of Western Ontario. And then Nicole Nussbaum, Barrister and Solicitor, and from the Canadian Bar Association, Seoban O'Brien and Marie-Laure Leclerc. Thank you for joining us, and we'll lead off with opening statements and remind you all up to 5 minutes from the Canadian Bar Association. Not sure which representative. Are you sharing this or? Okay, the floor is yours. The floor is yours.
Donc, tout d'abord, j'aimerais indiquer que je suis francophone. Donc...
So allow me to say that I'm a francophone. I will speak English for the panel, but I'm sorry if I'm not perfect.
My name is Marie-Laure Leclerc. My colleague and I are appearing today on behalf of the Canadian Bar Association. The CBA is a national association of 36,000 lawyers present in the 10 provinces and 3 territories, Quebec notaries, law professors and students, with a mandate to promote improvements in the law and the administration of justice. I'm a former executive member of the CBA's Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Community Forum, or SOGIC as we know it, CORIS en français, la Conférence sur l'orientation et l'identité sexuelle. SOGIC's mandate is to address the needs and concerns of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, and two-spirited people within the CBA.
Good morning, Honourable Chair, Senators. My name is Siobhan O'Brien. I'm a member of the CBA's Labour and Employment Law section. The section's mandate is to consider a wide range of work-related issues from all perspectives, so labour, management, and neutrals. I practice labour and employment law as well as human rights law with an expertise in workplace issues related to the LGBTQ population.
So we are here today with a simple message. The CBA support Bill C-16 without reservation or qualification. We encourage you to do the same. Human rights legislation is a powerful vehicle to guide understanding and education about the rights of all Canadians to redress harms caused by harassment and discrimination on prohibited grounds, and to advance a culture of inclusion and respect. The Canadian Human Rights Act is dedicated to the principle that all individuals should have an opportunity equal with other individuals to make for themselves the life that they are able and wish to have, and to have their needs accommodated, consistent with their duties and obligations as members of society, without being hindered in or prevented from doing so by discriminatory practices. The inclusion of gender identity and gender expression as prohibited grounds of discrimination will send an important signal to all Canadians that the transgender community is an integral part of our vision for a more tolerant and inclusive society. The hate crime provisions of the Criminal Code are intended to deter violence against vulnerable groups in society, the kind of violence that causes individuals to fear public spaces and forces them to defend their very humanity at every turn. The inclusion of gender identity and gender expression in the definition of identifiable group will send an important signal to all Canadians that the transgender community is an integral part of our vision for a safer and more democratic society. These amendments have been a long time coming. Too long, we say. In fact, the federal government finds itself as one of the last jurisdictions in Canada to acknowledge these rights in legislation. Yes, there continues to be opposition. Our written submission addresses some of the more current and, in our opinion, unfounded arguments against the bill, and we welcome the opportunity to address them during questions.
Senators, we'd like to focus on what Bill C-16 will achieve. The Bill C-16 amendments to the Canadian Human Rights Act will make explicit that it is a discriminatory practice for employers and for providers of goods, services, facilities, and accommodations to deny or differentially or adversely in the provision of any good, service, facility, or accommodation on the basis of gender identity and gender expression. It will be a discriminatory practice to refuse to employ or to continue to employ any individual based on gender identity and gender expression. It will be a discriminatory practice to adversely differentiate in the course of employment based on gender identity and gender expression. It will be a discriminatory practice to establish or pursue a policy that deprives an individual of employment or opportunities in employment based on their gender identity or gender expression. And it will be a discriminatory practice to harass an individual on the basis of gender identity and gender expression. Okay.
Ms. Bauer.
Honorable Chair and Senators, it's my pleasure to be here today to speak with you and to share with you some of what my community and academic colleagues and I have learned in over a decade of research on trans people in Ontario. I'm going to be presenting data focusing on data from TransPulse, funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, as we've published 21 academic peer-reviewed papers off of this, in addition to 3 book chapters and 14 reports or bulletins. So I'm only going to focus on a few key points. So in most regards, trans people in Ontario are similar socio-demographically to the population. Best estimates are that 1 in 187 people are trans. 80% of trans people knew prior to the age of 14 that their gender did not match what other people assumed it to be, even though most didn't begin living in that gender until much later. About 1 in 5 is non-binary and has a deeply held sense of themselves as something that doesn't fit neatly into male or female. There remain threats to the safety of trans people, negative impacts on their physical, mental, and social well-being, and challenges to their full participation in Canadian society. I'm just going to read off a few quick statistics on trans Ontarians. You've already heard that 13% have been fired for being trans, but another 15% were fired and thought it might be because they were trans. Can't always tell. 58% could not get academic transcripts with the current name or sex designation. Median income was $15,000 a year. Even amongst those who were living full-time, as men or as women, and had legally changed their names to reflect this, 70% had not been able to legally change the sex designations on all of their identity documents. 20% report physical or sexual abuse for being trans, and an additional 34% harassment or threats. Many did not report these assaults to the police. In fact, 24% report being harassed by the police. 32% as a result have had to move away for their safety or to access services, and this number was double amongst Indigenous gender-diverse participants. 77% worried about growing old as a trans person. And I could go on like this, but I think we understand some of the situation. So what I want to say is that despite the great resilience that trans people have, these experiences have consequences in creating a sense of hopelessness and creating fear of continual discrimination. So we know that trans people avoid medical care. We know that 21% have avoided going to the emergency department in a potential medical emergency. Can you imagine feeling safer outside of the emergency department in a potential emergency? And our data support the potential for social inclusion and gender affirmation to have strong positive impacts on the well-being of trans people. And we've seen this for the impacts of parental support for gender on trans youth. We've seen this in a lot of areas, but I just want to focus on one because we've recently done a very detailed analysis looking at intervenable factors that have the potential to reduce suicide risk in trans people. And we know that suicide risk, it's high. We know that it's not evenly distributed. Those who've experienced violence are at more risk of suicide. Those who are planning to transition but haven't begun are at high risk, whereas those who've completed are at 1% per year, down close to population rates. So in our analysis to identify intervenable factors, we found large impacts. I'm going to give you one example. We modeled this. If we were able to take transphobia, it's a broad measure, and we were able to reduce from current population rates down to the 10th percentile. That's to the point where trans people only experienced occasional incidents of transphobia. We predict a 47% reduction in serious consideration of suicide in a given year, from 34% of trans people to 18%. This means for every 100 trans people, 16 would have a much better year where they weren't in the kind of psychological distress that made them think of ending their life. Furthermore, we modeled that even amongst this then reduced number of people considering suicide, we modeled an additional 65% reduction in the attempt risk. So even those who were considering suicide would be less likely to actually act on that. So in addition, that's one finding. So in addition to protections from transphobia broadly, the other factors that we identified as potentially having a large impact were social support, gender support from parents specifically, protection from transphobic assault specifically, having ID concordant with one's gender, and gender-affirming medical care for those who needed it. I note that with the exception of general social support, these are all factors related to interpersonal, medical, or structural gender affirmation, or to protection from discrimination and violence. So in short, they relate directly to areas potentially impacted by Bill C-16. So I fully support this policy, obviously. I think that right now we have these protections in place elsewhere. We have full support for this. Every time we come back with more evidence. And I wanted to bring up one point that's slightly...
Sorry, you're not going to have time.
I don't have 30 seconds? Okay.
All right, Ms. Nussbaum.
Thank you, and I just want to apologize for not having a written submission. I've been dealing with some medical issues lately. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this bill, and I think the question for this committee and for the Senate is not really whether or not protections for gender identity or expression should exist at law in Canada. They do. Every court or tribunal which has had these matters before it has found that discrimination and harassment based on an individual's gender identity or expression are prohibited. That does not mean that the outcome of every case has been determined in a particular way, but there has been a finding that the protections exist. And there has not been a case in Canada that has found that gender identity or expression are not prohibited grounds of discrimination. Now, that being the case, some have asked why the need for the bill. First of all, I think the discussion that has ensued within the Senate, within the House, and nationally, the question of do these rights exist makes it very clear that the clarification, that clarity is needed. And with respect to the specific provisions of the bill, the need for explicit protections was formally recognized 17 long years ago in the report of the Canadian Human Rights Review Panel, chaired by former Supreme Court of Canada Justice Gerard Laforêt. And that was released in June 2000. The report made it clear that to leave the law as it stands would fail to acknowledge the situation of transgender individuals and allow the issues to remain invisible. And as we all know, since that date, the bill has been introduced several times. It has passed multiple times in the House of Commons, and it has never gotten to a final vote here in this House. Now, the Supreme Court of Canada has dealt with the issue of the exclusion of grounds of human rights from human rights legislation in the Vreen case. In that case, the court in Alberta was, and the Supreme Court eventually was called upon to determine whether or not Alberta's exclusion of sexual orientation from Alberta's human rights legislation violated the right of gay and lesbian people to equal benefit of the law. And the Supreme Court in that case found, number one, there were no protections that existed at law, so there was no legal recourse. That was one aspect of their finding. But the court went on and talked about the other impacts of being excluded from human rights legislation. And I'd like to read a couple of paragraphs from the decision. The court says, "Let us assume, contrary to all reasonable inferences, that exclusion from the legislation's protection does not actually contribute to a greater incidence of discrimination on the excluded ground. Nonetheless, that exclusion, deliberately chosen in the face of clear findings that discrimination on the ground of sexual orientation does exist in society, sends a strong and sinister message. The very fact that sexual orientation is excluded from the legislation certainly suggests that discrimination on the ground of sexual orientation is not as serious or as deserving of condemnation as other forms of discrimination. It could well be said that it is tantamount to condoning or even encouraging discrimination against lesbians and gay men. Thus, this exclusion clearly gives rise to an effect which constitutes discrimination." I think the court's analysis is very clear there and has direct applicability to the question of this bill. And you've heard about the high levels of and pervasive experiences of discrimination and harassment. I'm project lead on the Transforming Justice Translegal Needs Assessment Ontario, and we've did a survey, focus groups and workshops with trans people and legal service providers. We're about to publish our first report. We found that 43% of trans respondents to our survey reported dealing with issues of discrimination and harassment, and having legal issues with discrimination versus 5% of the general population.
And go on to questions, beginning with Senator Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for their very excellent presentations and their great contribution to the law, each one of you. Not just the lawyers there, but also Dr. Bauer. I say that, and I get to my one question that I'm going to ask. I was looking at a case that is presently before the Superior Court of Quebec that Senator Joyal has, and because he's appeared before the Quebec court many times, not as an accused, but as a lawyer. This is in French. This is in French, but it is what happens when we change the law, and then the government doesn't follow through on the necessary changes that should result from the change in the law. In Newfoundland, we do it very quickly. We changed the requirements of driver's licenses, birth certificates, and so on by using the case of XY versus Ontario, which you lawyers know all about. That's the seminal case in Canada for what we're talking about here today, provincially. But in Quebec, there is presently a case before the Superior Court, and I don't know whether Senator Joyal would agree, because it's presently before the court, whether we should be talking about it, but with reserve. Let me say this, and what struck me and gets to my question, Dr. Bauer, and I want to thank you for establishing the privilege of academics to conduct research without having to give away the names of those people who were interviewed, and you've established that, and now in case law we've had 3 subsequent cases. Here's what struck me, very simple question. They're using, in this particular case, they're using your study. And what they're saying is that you have established, by interviewing over 400 transgender persons, that I believe something like, reading the French, about 1/3 had contemplated suicide, brought down to about 10% or 4% if they had some identification, one piece of identification that identified them as being transgender. Am I misreading this? Yeah, I'm not, am I? So could you explain to the committee the significance of that? Those transgender persons who contemplate suicide and who commit suicide, in your study, of your seminal study, over 400 people in the province of Ontario. So could you explain that to us, the significance of enacting not just the law, but the government carrying through and making changes to their vital statistics and so on?
Thank you. So these structural factors are critically important. When we started this research, we started with existing research, which was largely psychological. And we talked about going in the direction of looking at resilience, how could trans people respond better, and then we realized nobody should have to be that resilient. Right? You shouldn't have to be that resilient because there are so many structural factors in place, and that's part of how the project evolved to be as policy relevant as it did. So with regard to identity documents, for those of you who haven't thought about it, imagine that you have no identity document that has an M or an F that matches your gender. You know, I'm at Western, you're a student at Western. Our students go out to drink a lot. You know, you're a young trans woman. Are you going to go to the bar and give the bouncer your driver's license that has an M on it, and then you're going to go drink? Think of how much risk young women are at for violence in bars where there's alcohol. What if you're not out to your friends? You're going to be outed to your friends at that. So you're not going to go out with your friends. You know, are you going to drive? Well, if you're pulled over and you have to produce that identity document, you're alone on the side of the road with the police officer. 24% of trans people have been harassed by police. how safe are you going to feel in that situation? There are people who don't travel internationally because of lack of consistent identity documents. There are people whose lives are so inhibited that, we looked at avoidance of public space. We were relating it to experiences of violence, not so much identity documents. But amongst the trans people who'd experienced transphobic assault, the majority were avoiding a large number of public spaces, and about a third were avoiding more than half of the types of spaces that we asked about. So people's ability to participate fully in social life and to access the public spaces that other people take for granted is tremendously impacted by these structural factors.
On Senator Platt.
Thank you, Chair. I have two questions, one for CBA and one for Ms. Palmer. I'll be brief in or no preamble. But presently, I'll ask both questions before either one answers, if that's all right. Presently, the only protected ground, and this is for CBA, that is not an immutable characteristic and is based on an internal and personal experience of gender is religion. There is protection for discrimination based on religion, but the expression of that religion, for example, wearing a niqab or a turban, is implicitly covered by this ground. Likewise, gender expression would be covered by gender identity. Would you not agree with that comment? And if not, why not? And then for Ms. Palmer, and Senator Baker has continually talked about the great laws that the provinces have and that every province has this law and how wonderful they all work. And yet we hear about the high rate of suicide, and he mentioned it just now again. Given that similar legislation has existed in many provinces, in Ontario for 5 years, why has it failed to stop the bullying, discrimination, and negative outcomes that we are hearing about? And why do you think that introducing it federally, when the vast majority of jurisdiction is provincial, not federal, that passing this bill will somehow stop or reduce all of that? So if CBA and then Ms. Palmer, please.
So in terms of commenting on gender expression, I'm sure my colleagues will want to jump in as to the terminology and what is or is not captured by gender identity. For my part, I am the lawyer, and for my part, gender expression is equally as important as gender identity, and as it's the manifestation of gender identity, and it's incumbent on lawmakers to ensure protection for gender expression so as to protect those individuals, for my part, in the workplace, so they can be ensured that they can express themselves in the workplace. As a human rights lawyer in the workplace context, I am not troubled by the proposed inclusion of gender expression, nor am I troubled by the fact that gender expression is not explicitly defined. Gender expression and gender identity are found in most Canadian human rights jurisdictions. Human rights decision makers have elaborated on the meaning of such grounds in hundreds of cases with reasonable outcomes and references to the purpose of the law. And decision makers interpret those grounds in other jurisdictions. They likewise interpret all grounds as they do here, because that's the operation of the common law system that we have. In addition to the case law, we have, as you've expressed, the commissions who are expressing law, although it's not leading, it does assist in the interpretation. If there is a concern about the scope of gender expression, it may assist to understand that other jurisdictions in interpreting gender expression do place parameters around what it may mean. So, for example, in Ontario, we have a number of cases coming out in 2016 that express that gender expression is not intended to capture a cisgender's intention of, for example, a male having a beard or a male expressing himself in a stereotypically male way. Those are not protected by the grounds of gender expression. So the application mechanisms of the law for that interpretation, I think, satisfactorily resolve the issue.
Ms. Bauer.
Okay, so in response, I would say that we actually don't have evidence as to whether or not these have gone down since policies have changed. What we have are a lot of different cross-sectional studies. We have TransPulse, we have the TransYouth study, we've got some current studies on access to medical care and on the health of trans youth referred for medical care. But nobody's been able to repeat a study twice to be able to see whether that's changed. So there's no evidence.
5 years in Ontario, and you haven't done a study?
We're still analyzing data from our first one. And now I'm running a study of trans youth referred for clinical care. So there are other priorities as well, but we hope to go back and to be able to collect more data. But there's no expectation. Let me just say, I don't think should be an expectation of an instant change to this. We know, for example, that having been physically or sexually assaulted for being trans is really strongly associated with suicide risk, but those past experiences don't go away, even if a change in policy could perfectly protect everyone going forward, which it won't. So those still carry forward, and moreover, even with increased safety, there's going to be a lag between increases in safety and people feeling safe and feeling not as risk. And so if you take a life course approach, people's past experiences will carry forward. But the other thing I'd like to say is that being life-saving isn't the threshold for human rights protections. I think there's no expectation that we only have these protections if they save lives and if they reduce suicide risk. I think we've got ample evidence of discrimination and the need for protection regardless of whether there was that outcome.
And thank you for your presentation. As a member of the CBA, it makes me proud with your presentations. It makes me proud that I have colleagues such as you, and also, of course, Professor Bauer. One of the things that I've been looking at a lot is that, and we had this in the hearings, the House of Commons Standing Committee, that the former bill, C-279, which addressed the same issues as this bill is addressing, some witnesses there stated that the bill did not, in fact, add new rights, since the case law indicates that gender identity is already considered to be an existing prohibited ground of discrimination. Rather, they claim that C-279 and now C-16 provide more explicit protection for transgender Canadians. Does Bill C-16 provide new rights that are not yet recognized by Canadian law?
I would answer that yes, it does. While it's true that when a complaint is filed on a ground not present in human rights legislation, that it may be found to be an analogous ground, and in the case of gender identity and gender expression, that's been found on the ground of sex in the Canadian human rights federal sphere. However, to do so requires an extra step on the part of the complainant. So implicit protections require a complainant to first prove that they're covered by the legislation and that they have a characteristic that is analogous to those explicitly stated in the legislation. And if there's no explicit protections, implicit protections may be challenged. And for example, I would point to a 2014 case out of Alberta, CF and Alberta Vital Statistics, where the government of Alberta contested that gender identity was analogous to sex. And the court had to determine that question before it was able to turn its mind to whether there was discrimination. And that challenge or contestation of the fact that gender identity was analogous to sex occurred despite the fact that that analogy has been drawn numerous times in the past by several jurisdictions.
Can I ask another question? There is sorry.
Oh, if I could just add to that. So the CF and Alberta case is quite an important case because it recognizes that the Charter protects gender identity as an analogous ground. So it's precedent-setting in that sense. With respect to the issue of whether or not this provides new protections, what I think it provides is recognition that there is an endorsement of the importance of the protection of these rights. A protection is a protection is a protection because no rights are absolute. Whether or not it's protected under an explicit ground or not, I don't think has much of an effect in terms of the scope of the protection. because, the application of each of these protections is going to be defined in the details of the particular case. And I think in terms of what the case law has said to date, it's nailed down a lot of the sort of middle ground, like the day-to-day bread and butter kinds of issues. Whether or not there are still little things that have to be determined on the peripheries of those general protections, competing rights, those sorts of things, I think those things will continue to be fleshed out by courts and tribunals, as they are with every other ground. These grounds are not unique, and I think some of the objections that have been raised are really not unique to gender identity and expression. They relate to every protected ground where rights butt up against each other, perhaps, arguably, or somebody would contest that. The other thing I would say is that, human rights law develops based on, it's a complaint system. It's not, so you have to take the facts of the particular case as it comes with the particular parties. What human rights legislation does at a higher level is to say that this kind of conduct is not acceptable. As the government policy for what we consider to be human rights of people in Canada, this is not acceptable. And then courts and tribunals on the facts of each individual case will apply those protections.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Ma question va être pour Madame Bauer.
My question is addressed to Ms. Bauer. I would like to speak about your study. In your study, do you divide data by province? And do you know anything about the behavior of citizens and companies by province?
Focusing on from the Transpulse project, and Transpulse was limited to the province of Ontario. So that's what we have. So that wouldn't inform cross-province. We still don't have good data from a lot of provinces in Canada.
Et est-ce que je comprends dans votre...
From what I understand then, in your data, you are studying the behavior of citizens and companies with regard to trans people.
In companies, so we were studying individuals, so 433 trans people in Ontario, 16 and older. And so, no, nothing about companies. People were reporting individual experiences, some of which might have been in employment settings, for example. But we weren't looking at company policy or behavior.
Si je vous disais à titre d'exemple,
If I were to give you the following example, when I was the president of the Police Association of Quebec, Police Forces of Quebec, a police officer came to see us who wanted to become transgender, and we supported him as an association, and we spoke to his employer, the Sûreté du Québec, and we ensured that he was in a work environment where he could carry out his transition. So it might be interesting to see what companies are doing to assist these people and support them. Because, of course, in transitioning in the workforce, it's not that easy to do, and certainly not in a police force, but we as an association, we supported this person.
That you supported that person, that's amazing. And I know that there are a lot of companies that have done very good work to develop explicit policies so that they're prepared when an employee comes to them with that kind of issue.
merci beaucoup, Madame. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Senator.
Thank you, witness, and thank you, Chair.
One argument put forward by the opponents of Bill C-16 is is a scenario where someone would refuse to address a transgender person by their chosen pronoun, and on, for instance, religious motives, and would, for that reason, be found guilty of discrimination or harassment, and for that reason, eventually end up in jail. So I wonder, maybe the CBA could answer, or Ms. Nussbaum, is that a probable scenario?
So the amendments to the Canadian Human Rights Act that are contemplated within Bill C-16 are not going to dictate that people must call somebody by a particular pronoun. I think that those discussions of pronouns have arisen in some of the academic contexts, and I'm sure my colleagues would agree, coming from an academic area, that these amendments are not going to hamper academic discussions or debates about sex and gender. Nothing in Bill C-16 compels such discussion. What the amendment does is make explicit the prohibition against discriminatory practices or harassment or sexual harassment based on gender identity or gender expression. And we've seen the Supreme Court of Canada, as my friend Nicole pointed out, have a discussion about competing rights in the case of Vriend, where it was argued that homosexuality and religious freedoms were competing rights. And the court found that the provincial legislation contained these internal mechanisms to balance those rival concerns, and they could likewise balance those rival concerns of expression, religion, and pronouns. That finding about the balancing that existed in the Vriend case equally applies here. The Canadian Human Rights Act operates in the same way, such that no conferral of rights is absolute, and there are internal mechanisms that already exist within your legislation that balances those rival concerns. So that internal mechanism provides for considerations of bona fide justifications that people might feel exist, provides for concerns about health, safety, and cost that might limit accommodations in terms of the prohibited grounds. So those mechanisms are found at Section 15 of the existing Canadian Human Rights Act. And so they provide that where there's a bona fide occupational requirement in the workplace, that the practice would not be considered discriminatory. Or when we're talking about the accommodations, goods, services, and facilities, where there's a bona fide justification, it would not be considered discriminatory. And when we're talking about bona fide justifications, the legislation has already built in mechanisms that require you to be able to establish that you cannot accommodate the individual, considering things like cost, health, and safety. So those concerns about bona fide justifications and undue hardship that may be caused in terms of other competing rights are already built into the legislation and have been subject to an abundance of legislative interpretation.
And what are the probabilities of someone being accused of hate speech because of Bill C-16 being adopted?
I'm not a criminal lawyer, but as a lawyer, I would suspect that it would be very, very low.
Ms. Nussbaum, would you care to comment?
Yes, so I'm just pulling up.
Very briefly, please.
Very briefly. 319. So 318, everyone who advocates or promotes genocide. So unless you're promoting genocide, you're not covered by that. Communicating statements in a public place inciting hatred where such incitement is likely to lead to a breach of the peace. I'm not sure that pronouns get to that level. Communicating statements other than in private conversation, willfully promoting hatred against any identifiable group. I'm not sure that that rises to that level. So, no, but in terms of the pronoun issue, so what we've heard about non-binary people. Non-binary, what are called non-binary pronouns, are actually gender-neutral pronouns, right? So they're not ascribing a gender to a person. The issue with harassment.
I'm sorry, I did say briefly.
Sorry.
Senator Batters.
Thank you very much. To Ms. O'Brien, did you support the previous bill, C-279, that was in the previous Parliament, which did not include gender expression as an identifiable group?
I'm not sure that of the position of the CBA at that stage. I'm afraid I'm not sure I was practicing at that stage.
Ms. Leclerc, you're also here from the CBA.
Well,
did the CBA support Bill 279?
Okay, first thing, one of the reason why I am here is because I've been an activist all my life, but I'm a lawyer an IP lawyer, but I've been an old-timer transgender person. I've been there. I've walked the walk, and I've done that for.
Do you know if the CBA supported Bill
Yes, with regard.
C-279?
Well, yes, we do, but with regard to the distinction to be made between gender identity
I
or.
have a few other questions, so I
Yes.
just want to know the answer, whether the CBA supported Bill C-279 or not.
I have no recollection. I have no recollection.
I'm a past chair of the Canadian Bar Association's Sexual Orientation Gender Identity Conference.
Yes.
We did in fact support the bill. We did call for gender expression to be included, and we were opposed to definitions being introduced.
Okay, thank you. So to Ms. O'Brien again, because of the previous comment you made here at the committee, what about those provincial jurisdictions which don't include gender expression as an identifiable group? Do you think that those particular provincial laws provide less protection to transgender individuals?
Again, I would say I'm not troubled by the inclusion of gender expression in this legislation, and what I point to is the abundance of case law interpreting the particular definition and the scope of that the scope of that prohibited ground throughout
But could you
Canada.
answer my question? Do you think that those provincial laws that do not include gender expression provide less protection to transgender individuals?
Yes.
Okay, and what protections would not be offered?
I'm going to defer to some of my colleagues in terms of what I
You
don't want to.
made the statement earlier before saying that, about the gender expression issues. So I'm wanting to hear your legal opinion from the CBA. What protections would not be included in those particular provincial jurisdictions' laws?
So I think you may not want to accept the answer, but my answer is that while other provinces' legislation may just include gender identity, I am not troubled by the fact that in this legislation we want to include gender identity and gender expression. I think that will capture what is intended to be captured here.
Are you saying that because you think that gender expression is basically already included in the term gender identity? Is that why you're making that distinction?
No, I'm saying that because the term gender expression has been subject to an abundance of case law that has reasonably interpreted it.
Right. Prior to this bill coming into effect. Thank you.
Correct.
All right. Senator Dupuy.
My question is first for Professor Bauer, and thanks to all of you for being here. The study that you referred to, the report on the review of the Canadian Human Rights Act, was drawn up following a consultation across Canada, whole of Canada approach. That was the mandate of the committee, and witnesses were heard. I was a member of this committee, you see. So witnesses were heard, transgender persons, individuals who told us about what they were going through on a day-to-day basis and the discrimination they faced. My question to you, Professor Bauer, you've carried out research. And back then, by the way, people had to go through a surgical transformation in order to be able to come out and be known as transgenders. We know that there are some provinces and territories where that's no longer required. Now, what's the state of medical research? Because there are many doctors who do know about this since the beginning of this century, and the more recent period, the researches you have carried out, are doctors understanding this issue better now?
I think that we have made a lot of progress. I think that the early research was very focused on surgery. The early research in medicine was very focused on that. From our research, we know that even amongst the approximately quarter of trans people who say they've completed a medical transition, not everybody has these surgeries. Lots of people do not, for a whole variety of reasons. And they certainly shouldn't feel compelled to, which is part of the reason for removing that from the qualifications for changing identity documents. Nobody should have to undergo forced sterilization and forced surgery. And so, but with regard to medical research in regard to informing care, we've made a lot of progress toward not only the research in that area, but also to moving training into medical schools. So, for example, I'm in a medical school at Western, and we've introduced content into social medicine in year one. We've introduced basic hormonal care into endocrinology. We have standardized patients, so practice patients that the students work with who are trans. And so the goal is to improve medicine to the point that doctors will all have a basic familiarity. So when the first patient walks in who's trans, it won't be a surprise. A basic competence with uncomplicated hormone care, and then of course things that are more specialized will be handled by specialists. So we do still have research to do. I'm leading a large national study that starts collecting data this summer on trans kids, trans youth, not really kids, but trans youth referred for puberty blockers or for hormone treatment. And we're going to gather data from 9 clinics across Canada because we need to know more, not just about their medical well-being, but their social and their family well-being as well.
Merci.
Senator Almadvar.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of you. I think this question is to any or all of the lawyers. We heard yesterday about the unintended outcomes of expanding the Canadian Human Rights Code in this way, that we would open the door to other new emerging rights-seeking groups. The example of transracialism or fat phobia was put on the table. And I would wonder if you could comment on this. Is it right for us to deny their people rights today because of what may be coming up in the future? What's our history in this, if that's a point?
I would just point out in brief, and let my colleagues take over from there, that I think the slippery slope argument here has very little merit. Perhaps we could point to the fact that we're sitting here and we've had to try to get this legislation through quite a number of times, despite the fact we have our Supreme Court of Canada's comments and very end that Nicole so eloquently put this morning.
So in other words, you're not concerned about it?
I'm not concerned about a slippery slope.
Not only that, but I mean, I suppose it's important once again to stress the benefit that will whatever problem we may face in the future that may result are certainly counterbalanced by the benefit for all the members of the transgender community for the symbol and the signal that the adoption of this change will bring.
Senator Joyal.
My question first to the Canadian Bar. Any of you might answer. I am of the personal opinion that to compel somebody to go to physical surgery to change sex or to express the identity chosen by the person is, in my opinion, contrary to Section 7 of the Charter. And have you ever considered the Canadian Bar to fight any provincial legislation that would have had in the book? I'm addressing my question to Madame Leclerc because you know that in the Quebec legislation, it had that, and I thought it was barbarous practice as much as
tout ce que je peux répondre, Maître Joyal,
all I can say, Senator Joyal, is that at the time when I faced this problem, this wasn't seen to be a problem. So I took the path that I had to take. But I would like to mention that, there's been mention made of legislation that could identify this group as an identifiable group and the benefits that would bring to the individuals in it. It's been said that it would merely be symbolic, given that the current legislation sufficiently defends these people. But I think that we are a society that uses symbols. We have the Canadian flag behind us here. All these symbols count for Canadians. The first time that I touched a criminal code, the first clause I checked was to see whether there was a section in the criminal code that allowed for sex changes. And this was back in the beginning of the 80s. And I always had as a hope, in fact, as a symbol I held in my mind, that such legal provision would become a reality in Canada. So if these changes come into effect, an identifiable group being designated and that each individual in this group will be protected but also the very fact that these people will be identified as being members of a group, that they will no longer be left alone, abandoned, and feel abandoned. This will be a symbol, yes, an important one. As for surgery, I've known a number of people who have gone through surgery. Of course, there was a lot of difficulty at the time figuring out how the doctors were going to respect their own codes of conduct and the people's needs and so on. I remember going to see the bar at the time, and that I was not allowed to practice using my new name during the transition period, so I had to continue to practice using my male name, but I was dressed as a woman and so on. So, you know, it wasn't that simple. I'm certainly not the right person, perhaps, to testify against surgery, because in my case, it was very beneficial. I certainly respect the new transgender persons who decide not to take that path, or who may decide to use surgery, sex-affirming surgery in the future. I can only tell you that basically it's about an internal identity. We are chemical beings, and the chemistry counts. It's very useful to describe to you what it's like to be internally different. It's also difficult to explain what the real internal driver is that leads a very young person to ask questions about their identity and their gender identity. Back then, there were no media, no community networks that helped me deal with the situation. Moreover, morality was so strongly imposed. It was something that was totally unacceptable in our society, and we had to fight, much as homosexuals did back then, until we were facing a blank wall. And then, you know, you had to jump, you had to make a decision, you had to come out. And anyone who's trans knows what that's like. They have really felt that they are a soul that's wound up in the wrong body, and that's, you know, a real internal truth expressed however it is by specific individuals. And we are now in a society where this whole issue is coming to the fore. Things are changing. Youth can now deal with these issues much more openly. All the people you see here are people who are probably over 40 years old. You'll be meeting youth, and you will see how differently they think about this whole issue. It's changing so quickly.
Two senators on with questions here with limited time. Senator Pate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you to all of you witnesses. Ms. Bauer, a few weeks ago, I was at a conference where Dr. Lawson spoke about some of the work that she's been doing at the CHIO here. And when you mentioned you're going to be doing research, I'm curious as to whether you're seeing any of the trends that she described. And I had asked her, you know, what was her understanding of why the changes were happening. But she said that they've now seen this spike of, over the past 2 years, about 75% of young, initially sex-identified as girls, trans boys. So I'm not sure if you're seeing the same, if you have any ideas as to, and not as particularly relevant to the legislation. I was just very interested. That's sort of what I would have expected 10 years ago, and you know, so, and we didn't see it. So I'm just curious as to what you're.
So Dr. Lawson's my co-principal investigator on the study, so it's the same study, we start data collection this summer, but we have analyzed data from our 9 clinics on referrals over the last decade. And so what we've seen, if I showed you a graph, is this exponential spike in referrals of youth. And I think that that's an amazing thing. I don't think that there are necessarily more trans youth, but people are putting a name to it at a younger age. I think the internet's helped a lot. And so these are people who in the past might have gone 10 years, 20 years thinking they're the only person in the world like themselves, who are now able to do that at a younger age, and sometimes people able to socially transition at even younger ages. So I know that they're seeing a shift in the balance based on assigned sex at the clinics, but that group of kids that come into clinic, there are a lot of factors that impact that. They're not necessarily representative of the whole group of trans youth, right? And at the younger ages, they're more likely to have parental support to get in the door. Older youth sometimes come in without parental support. And so I don't think we can take what we see in the clinic and say that that group really represents trans youth overall, because most trans youth never make it into the clinics.
Right. And is the trend she's seeing in terms of, or that you're both seeing, obviously, is that across clinics or just at the CHIO?
No, it's across clinics.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and talking to my colleagues internationally, it's internationally as well, even in countries like the Netherlands, where we're an early leader in terms of clinical care for trans youth.
Okay, final question, Senator Mitchell.
Thanks, Chair. I know we're late. Back to definitions, I just want to clarify this. It's interesting that there is, when 279 was over there, in order to get support from Conservative MPs, it was they moved a motion to define gender identity. When it came over here, Senator Platt moved a motion to take the definition out. Clearly, there's ambivalence. But the argument is that you don't need to do it, one, because no other element is defined, and two, because there is all kinds of on-the-ground, real-time cases before tribunals and before courts across the country where it has been defined. Is that true?
Moi, j'aimerais souligner un aspect, c'est que dans
I would like to underscore something here. The bill, and this is my point of view, doesn't mention gender identity and gender expression. It's or. It's not and, it's an or.
Up. You have an inside and you have an outside. Yeah. You cannot separate one from the other. It's just two aspects of the same thing. Yeah. And that's my perception of it, and I don't know whether the tribunal will go that way. With regard to the absence of a definition, I suppose it's not the only law that will require the definition of tribunals. That's what they are doing.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you all witnesses for being here today and assisting us with our deliberations. Much appreciated. Adjourned.